Okay, well, I guess we'll get started here. So hello, everyone, and welcome to this Forestry Adaptation Community of Practice webinar today. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Annette Morand, and I am the facilitator of the online Climate Change Adaptation Communities of Practice, which is run by us here at OKR, which is the Ontario Centre for Climate Impacts and Adaptation Resources, and we're located at Laurentian University in Sudbury, Ontario. So the way the webinar will run is as follows. So after this short introduction, we'll have the main presentation, which will go for about 35 to 40 minutes. And then at the tail end of the webinar, we'll have some time left over for any questions that you might have for the presenter. So if you do have any questions during the webinar, we just ask that you please hold them until the end. And before we get going, I just have a few housekeeping items to go over. So first, for those of you who dialed into the conference call line, your lines have been automatically muted, and the reason for this is just to avoid any audio distractions, feedback, etc. during the webinar. So if you'd like to ask a question during the Q&A session, all you'll have to do is dial *6 to unmute your lines, but we do ask you to keep them muted during the presentation. Also, you'll notice that there's a chat box on the left-hand side of your screen. You can use this chat box to field any questions that you might have for the presenter during the question and answer period. As well, if you have any technical difficulties during the webinar, you can also use this chat area to type your message, or you can click on my name and send me a private message, and I can try to help you as best as I can. I also want to mention that we are recording the webinar today, and I'll be sending out a copy of the recording to all those who have pre-registered with me, and we'll also be posting it to the Community of Practice website. And finally, I know we have some people on the line today who may not be familiar with what the Forestry Adaptation Community of Practice, or the FACOP, is. So quickly before we start, I just want to mention that the FACOP is an interactive online community, and it's dedicated to those who are working in the forestry field or who are interested in forestry and climate change adaptation in Canada. So it provides a private space where members can share information and best practices on current activities in the area of climate change vulnerability and adaptation in Canada's forest sector. And it's free to join, so if there's anyone on the line today who's interested in learning more about the FACOP, you can contact Jason Edwards or myself, and our email addresses are in the chat box on the left there. So with that being said, I want to extend a very warm welcome to Dr. Richard Schneider, who has generously donated his time today to present this webinar for us on conserving biodiversity in the face of climate change. What is the objective? And just so you know a little bit more about your presenter, Richard is a wildlife ecologist in the Department of Biological Sciences at the University of Alberta. He has a degree in veterinary medicine from the University of Saskatchewan and a PhD in wildlife epidemiology from the University of Guelph, and has extensive experience in computer modeling in the areas of wildlife management and forest management. Over the past 20 years, Richard has been actively involved in the development of forest management policy in Alberta and has written several influential papers and a book on this topic. His main interest is in modeling land use and biodiversity trends under alternative management scenarios, and he has recently published a study on behalf of the Alberta Biodiversity Monitoring Institute looking at the potential effects of climate change on Alberta's ecosystems. So on behalf of everyone listening in, I'd like to extend a very big thank you to you, Richard, for taking time out of your day to present this webinar for us. It is very much appreciated. So without further ado, I will now turn things over to you. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I'll start just by way of further introduction to say that the work that I'm presenting here is part of a larger project. It's being run under the Alberta Biodiversity Monitoring Institute, the University of Alberta and the Stack Institute, looking at ecological change in Alberta under climate change and looking at developing adaptation strategy. So it's a 3-year program that we're just about 2/3 of the way through. I just should also note that the work that I do is more at the coarse filter level. There are a lot of species level projects ongoing. So just to put in context, I'm looking at sort of the big picture issues here. And the project that I led last year resulted in a report that I'll give you a link to at the end of the presentation. But it was looking at Alberta's natural subregions that are coarse level ecosystem classification systems use, and looking at projecting the changes of subregions both into the past and the future. What I'm going to look at here today, though, is the issue of objectives. And I think this quote here by Camacho et al. Really sets the stage for the topic. Climate change complicates the achievement of conventional management objectives in ways that make it necessary to unpack the relationship underlying motivating principle. So to get into that, we need a starting point, and what I've drawn from here is from the Canadian Biodiversity Strategy. I think this basic conservation goal has been expressed in different ways in different places, but this is as good as any. Maintenance or sustainable use of Earth's resources in order to maintain ecosystems, species, and genetic diversity and the evolutionary and other processes that shape them. So it's going to be my kind of touchstone or the fundamental starting point that I use and refer back to as I go forward and look at the implications of climate change and how to react to it. But before going on, I want to make another point about context. This goal was derived from a much broader process that arguably could be traced back to the 1970s, where we had that growth of global environmental awareness, and eventually leading to the Brundtland Commission and the idea of sustainable development in the late 80s. And you can draw a direct dotted line from the Canadian Biodiversity Strategy to that Brundtland report and this whole concept of sustainable development. So the point I'm making here is that the goal that we've used today was originated in the context of sustainable development. It was never the intent to in some way preserve a unique or specific state of the environment and keep it that way forever. The intent was more to prevent harm, and that becomes important as we look at how we can continue to manage or attain this goal in the future. Going forward, I'm going to spend just a couple of slides here, or 3 or 4, I guess just to set the stage in terms of, do we really have a problem? I suspect most of the people here on the line would not find that a big issue, but I think it just for completeness, let's look at this. Is there really a threat to biodiversity from global warming, and what is the nature of that? And that's the intent here, is to provide a context for a look at how this impacts objectives. So if we can start, this is a map of the subregions, the major ecosystems of Alberta. That's obviously my case study. It's where I'm working from. And if we can just start with a thought experiment to say, what if climate change was considered to be like an enormous bulldozer, and we just more or less shifted everything straight north? Have we caused a loss to biodiversity by that happening? Well, arguably no. Let me get my pointer going here. Certainly, some of the, we call this here the northern mixed wood drop off the Alberta map, but is it really a loss of biodiversity? Not really, since that's now in NWT, and we actually gain some species down here from Montana and so on. So the point I'm making here is that we cannot necessarily assume that change is equivalent to a loss, but it does present problems, because in terms of management, we have divided the world into jurisdictional units that different people are responsible for. So, for example, if you're a manager in the dry mixed wood area, and now that's turned into a parkland, the objectives that you were required to work towards may no longer make sense. So even though biodiversity may not view change as a problem, you as a manager are faced with some serious concerns, and the question of how to go forward is kind of at the heart of this presentation. But before going there, I want to point out this as a very simplistic view, of course. In reality, the shift is not simply north. The patterns are very complex, and there are going to be winners and losers in terms of the extent of various subregions and the species that live within them. Whether or not that's an issue is a point of discussion, and I'll touch on that. There are other problems that I think just worth noting here. The species that exist in Alberta today certainly have the ability to adapt to climate change. I mean, we've gone through several cycles of glaciation, and species that couldn't handle climate change of that extent, well, they've been weeded out long ago. But that's not to say that they can adapt to anything. And so the concern is that the pace of change, at least under the medium to high-end climate scenarios, are possibly going to be too fast for species to keep up with. We also have barriers today on the environment that didn't exist during those past episodes of climatic change, barriers related to our activities on the landscape. For example, there may be physical barriers we've put in place, or it could be simply changes in habitat quality. I'll point out a couple examples in a minute. Anyway, the world isn't the same as it was earlier, and so some of the adaptive capacity that species have is stymied by the barriers or just simply the pace of change. I'm just going to take one slide here, just a bit of a diversion, but hopefully it'll be of relevance to you. Just pointing out some of the specific kinds of changes that we are facing here in Alberta, and then I'll move on to the specific topic of how to react to it. Objectives. So just giving you the starting point is Alberta's natural subregions. The detail isn't important here, but just to point out, grab my pointer, which I don't see. Sec. My computer is hiccuped. Apologize for that. I'll just carry on, and I think, here we go.
Do you see the arrow?
Yeah, it didn't show up when I did that. We're good now, and then it had to reload, and so it just took a moment. It's all good now.
Okay.
I just wanted to point out that this area here is our grassland. This brown is transitional parkland. All the green is boreal forest. We'll touch shield up here, and the rest here is foothills and Rocky Mountains. So this slide here is drawn from that earlier report I mentioned. I've just chosen one as an example projection into the 2080s of a climate envelope. Now, to be clear, this is not the ecosystems necessarily. There's going to be a lag in terms of how ecosystems follow, but what I'm showing you is where the climate envelopes are going to be in 2080 under a median kind of climate scenario. So the main point here is now we've got grasslands that are much farther north. In fact, the fescue is all over the boreal, and the large part of the boreal has got parkland habitat, and what we consider boreal today is kind of relegated to these hilltop systems here. So specific impacts, or, I mentioned winners and losers. There are a variety of them. I'll just point out a few of the main ones. In the prairie here, because of the increased heating and evapotranspiration, the wetlands, which are real hotspots for biodiversity in that dry environment, are going to decline in extent and have more dry periods. The fescue grassland, which is this region here, is climate is going to be moving north, but what happens to the species is they run into the parkland region, which has almost entirely been converted to agricultural land. So what I mentioned about barriers earlier, that's a really good example of that. Going northward into the boreal forest, certainly the mixed wood will, the spruce component of our mixed aspen and spruce pine forest, that coniferous component is going to have a very hard time early on, particularly related to regeneration and old growth. Part. As soon as you start increasing the rate of fire, that's going to knock back the percentage of old growth. Peatlands certainly are expected to decline in extent. They comprise about 45% of the central mixed wood. Interesting point about Alberta is that the amount of precipitation in this northern area here is roughly equivalent to what you see here in the fescue grassland. The only reason why this is forest is that it's cooler there and there's less evapotranspiration. So as soon as you start warming the land and drying it, the peatlands are going to scale back. The forest will have change as well. And the permafrost communities up in the tops of these mountains are already starting to melt. The specific gene types that are there are going to reduce in extent. Same up here in the alpine communities, get pushed toward the sky and having to reduce in extent. Now, I'll stop there. Just wanted to give a sort of flavor of what we're facing. Perhaps it's more than in some other areas. I'm not familiar with how change is going to play out in other parts of Canada, but for us, it's a pretty big deal because we've got this potential for a real tipping point in the boreal, and I think it really is a critical issue. So, okay, getting on to objectives, and just to reprise the goal maintain ecosystem species and genetic diversity in the face of human development, keeping all the pieces. Okay, so that's I touched on the fundamental goal that we have. How do we actually do it? Well, the reality is we don't have the knowledge or not near the capacity that would be required to actually manage all species individually. So what we do is manage by proxy, indicators of certain ecosystem elements, and use those to give us a sense of where a broader swath of biodiversity is and how it's doing. And of course, there are certain select species, especially those at risk of extinction, where we do manage directly. But what the key here is that we want to maintain, right? This is what we're after. We're maintaining ecosystem species and so on. So if you're going to maintain something, we need a reference point. We need to know how we're doing as we move forward in time. And again, because as I mentioned, we've divided the world up into specific management units. To do this, we've spatially defined benchmarks, and these are fixed. So if you're in a forest area, we might say, for this forest management area, here's a specific amount of old-growth forest that used to exist. That's our reference point. The same might occur for species. We might say historically, species X would have a range of, in this region, certain abundance, and that could be our reference point, and those can be tracked through time. Of course, there's a last step. The benchmarks are not the same as objectives. They are inputs into the actual management objectives, because the land base, excuse me, has multiple values that we're trying to achieve at the same time, and there's juggling and compromise that needs to go on. But my focus here is really on these benchmarks. If we consider the actual development of an objective to be a negotiation, if you will, or evaluation of trade-off, you need to know what the specific starting points are for every different value. So in the case of biodiversity, we want to have a very clear notion of what it is that we're giving up going into the compromise objectives. We want to keep track of that pure objective, if you will, as we go forward. So that's sort of a snapshot of where we are today. My main point that I want to bring forward, though, is that the reference points that we're using are, by and large, they're spatially defined, they're fixed. The understanding is, or they were developed at the time where the assumption was the climate changing. So the challenge we have going forward is to find a way to adapt these objectives and benchmarks to the new reality that we've got from climate change. But we don't want to lose fidelity to those earlier values and norms that were underlying the development of our goal for biodiversity conservation. We want to stay true, if you will, to that original goal, but adapt our way of doing things to our new reality. So what I'm going to present to you now are a few different, I think 3 or 4 different approaches that we might do this by, and I've kind of encapsulated them as separate units. In reality, I expect that what we'll do is pick and choose from these various options. Some will be used at different points in time, but I think for point of discussion, and there I should say there is a discussion paper underlying this that's available to you. Just need to ask me. I've my email shown at the end. Anyway, for the point of discussion, it's easier to just package things separately so you can understand them more clearly. But I expect it will be mixing and matching as we go forward. So one approach is simply wait and see. Continue to use static benchmarks. Now, is that a rational approach in the face of all this climate change that I've mentioned? Well, actually, I think it is. And I've listed a few reasons why it does make sense to continue using these static benchmarks. For starters, there is an enormous amount of uncertainty at present regarding the amount of change that will happen. For, in other words, the spread between the least change and the maximum change that's being projected under various scenarios of greenhouse gas emissions and so on, it's huge. And so, maybe it's going to be necessary to see some empirical change. And I mean, there is actually some already, but enough to convince managers such that, I can have a good sense now of which track this is heading down, and I can begin to manage along that new track. But until I have some evidence that I'm really going to need to change, I'm going to sit back and wait and see. And that's quite reasonable, I would say. Second, there are capacity limitations. Certainly in Alberta, I expect it's probably broadly applicable. The budgets we have for biodiversity conservation, the staff time and so on are very limited, and it's not, you come forward and say, in 50 years there's going to be a problem because of climate change and so on, and you say, well, look, today I'm dealing with crises that'll, is a make or break for species in the next 10 years. You have to take a number, and eventually we'll get to that. We just don't have the capacity to deal with all the potential issues, especially if they're not critical today, and if there's so much uncertainty tied to it as well. So capacity limitations are an issue. Third, humans just generally don't like change, and particularly if it threatens personal values. If your career has been built on protecting a certain species or ecosystem element, and now somebody comes along and says climate change, says that's all wrong, you very well may say, wait a minute, not so fast. Fourth, lack of an alternative. So it's one thing to say that the existing system is not going to work over the long term, fine, but until you come up with a meaningful alternative, you can't actually change. And we're only at the very beginning of thinking about what those alternatives might look like. And I mean, this presentation is part of that. It's going to be a long road before I think we've really got a sense of where that might go. And finally, this concept of political inertia. And what I'm talking about here, most specifically, is that I mentioned the actual objectives that we put in place on the ground vis-a-vis biodiversity are negotiated objectives. They're compromises in most cases. And those compromises are often hammered out over many years, or often represent hard-fought battles. Let's say how much, what is required in context of maintaining caribou, when that might mean, shutting down certain industries. Something is going to be done, but it's a long and hard negotiation before that final decision is finally made. Now you come forward and say, well, that all doesn't work anymore because of climate change. You have to reopen all of those decisions. Well, that's not going to happen very quickly, because there's so much work to be required to look at those issues all again. So those are reasons why we might want to just take a slow approach, or reasons why at least it'll be slow. But there certainly are problems by using the wait and see approach, and I've listed 3 here. First of all, the static benchmarks are eventually going to become irrelevant. So as I said, if you're a manager in a certain area required to have companies maintain a certain amount of old growth, then that areas now turn into a parkland, well, that objective really doesn't make sense anymore, and management will logically just shift in response and do something that does make sense. If we just go with those kind of ad hoc solutions, it's equivalent of losing management control. That you have a system where everybody's doing everything, according to their own rules. It's not a good way to manage overall. There's lack of integration and so on. Now, that's not a problem for today, since the benchmarks that we have haven't changed appreciably. In some cases, they have, but by and large, they work fairly well. So this is a problem for tomorrow. It will be a very serious problem for tomorrow, but it's something that is not an immediate problem. So wait and see, actually not too bad immediately, but will have to change. Second is the issue of lack of preparation for the future. Even though some of these issues are not really manifest for some decades into the future, it's going to take a fair amount of time for us to prepare for them. I use the analogy here of the transition sustained yield forestry to the natural disturbance model and integrated resource management and some of the state-of-the-art practices that we're rolling out today. Well, I've been doing this for almost 20 years now, and that process is still underway. So I can certainly imagine that if we start today in terms of preparing for climate change, well, 20 years from now, it also will be slowly rolling out to the point where it actually is able to do things. As I mentioned, the ecological, so the institutional inertia will take years and years until climate change embeds itself and really becomes part of it. And also, there's all kinds of research that's going to need to be done, pilot studies and so on, that are going to take many, many years to prepare for and run and then record results for, and so on. So if we are quite strict in terms of, let's say, not so simply wait and see, but ignoring climate change as an issue, we may be less likely to prepare or to start prepare for what will come in the future. I think that would be a mistake. Now, one could separate here the idea of we could, on one hand, start to prepare, but keep the old benchmarks. So there is a way forward here. Different pieces go forward. But I think if we are very strict about wait and see, it may lead to less preparation that might otherwise be indicated. Lastly, I have put the point here that a very strict view or adherence to existing benchmarks would position the ecological effects of climate change as a threat that has to be resisted. It's one more thing that's a problem to me meeting my objective. And what that can do is lead to maladaptive actions or inefficient allocation of resources. I have a couple of examples to show what I mean by that. To begin, we have, at least in Alberta, we have a lot of old well paths and seismic lines and such on the landscape that are now being reclaimed. Now, if you're going to be strict about maintaining existing benchmarks, you'd say, well, as we go forward and begin to reforest some of these areas, we should be planting trees that were there at the time that the trees were initially cut. Well, we know from the research from Andreas Hamann, Laura Gray, and others that the climate envelopes in at least in areas here have moved north by over 100 kilometers. So if you plant what used to grow there some decades ago, they're already out of sync today, let alone with respect to the climate 20 years or 50 years from now. So it may not reflect actual species choice, but certainly the genetic stock is not appropriate anymore to be using the genotypes that used to be there long ago. So we might be planting things that are not appropriate for the long term. Another example has to do with, with caribou. Here I'm showing the subregions as you've seen them earlier, and in red are the current ranges for woodland caribou in Alberta. Now, what happens when the climate changes and the climatic envelopes move, and we are strictly focused on the benchmarks as they are today? What I'm showing here on the left is the future distribution of our subregions under a minimal change scenario. So kind of the subregions are effectively just moving one subregion down the line. So if I can get this pointer here going. We see here now what used to be dry mixed wood, where the pointer is now parkland habitat, and central mixed wood here is now effectively having a dry mixed wood climate. The reason this is important is that caribou are tightly focused to the peatland habitat, and in the central mixed wood, there's about almost 50% of the central mixed wood is comprised of peatlands. If you look at the dry mixed wood, the amount of peatland in the dry mixed wood is only about 15%. So we're seeing a great difference in the amount of quality caribou habitat, if you look at it that way, in the difference between the dry mixed wood and the central mixed wood where they exist today. In fact, you notice there's caribou here at all. So what happens then if you strictly rely on existing benchmarks and you allocate all of your effort to maintaining all the herds where they are today? You can end up with a situation where herds in some of these low elevation areas where they are liable to lose habitat early on, essentially get all of your effort, because you're forced to maintain all the herds. Means the ones that are greatest risk of disappearing get increasing amounts of effort. An alternative approach is to say, at least the discussion you could have if you include climate change in the discussion, is to say, well, some of these herds are likely to carry on over the very long term in a pretty good state. Ones that are existing at the tops of these hill systems, the boreal is likely to be maintained there for a very long period, even under some of the more extreme climate scenarios. So the point I'm making here is that if the amount of the capacity you have for conservation is limited, then climate change may make you start to consider options that you have to look at in terms of how to allocate resources. It may not be simply a matter of doing everything the same everywhere. That's really become clear in the case of Arctic grayling. The map I'm showing here shows the existing range of Arctic grayling, this gray, and the black dots show where the populations are in decline. And obviously here in the case of Arctic grayling, the link between climate and the status of the species is very direct. You warm the water very quickly, you get to the point where grayling cannot survive anymore, and so that's why you see the distribution of these declining populations along the southern end of their range. So again, strictly speaking, where would you put most of your effort if you want to maintain everything the way it is? Well, you have to work on these declining populations here, because they're the ones that are really in trouble. Does this make sense in the face of climate change? Arguably not, because these are effectively lost. In fact, managers today already recognize that, and they're already starting to consider where we can maintain Arctic grayling 50 years from now. So there's an example of this ad hoc decision making where it's become clear that it doesn't make sense anymore to try to keep populations that are they're going to be lost no matter what you do, and reallocate your effort to where it makes more sense. So that's sort of the wait and see approach. An alternative is what I'm labeling here as a dynamic benchmark approach. And to implement that requires a small tweak to the conservation objective that I mentioned earlier, or the fundamental goal. The wording here is the same first half of the sentence: maintain ecosystem structures, patterns, and such as a new part is as they would be in the absence of human disturbance. So the focus is now being made very explicit that we're trying to maintain biodiversity by protecting it from human disturbance, but we're not necessarily going to react to climate change. What we're doing in that case is we're going to treat climate change as a natural phenomenon, even though we all understand that the current episode of global warming is anthropogenic in origin. But arguably that's irrelevant once the climate has actually changed. So it's one thing to try to prevent climate from increasing to change, but once it actually has changed, once we have an extra degree or extra 2 degrees, that's effectively permanent, at least in terms of the 100 years that we might conceivably think of managing. We're not going to be able to turn back the clock. So it's something that we're going to have to now adjust to or treat as if it was natural, because there's nothing to do about it. What might this look like in practice? I think it's easiest to understand with an example. If you were a manager, say in this part of the boreal forest, and you're tasked with managing biodiversity, and as I said, you need some kind of a reference. Well, you could use the historical state as your reference point, and then over the next, say, 100 years, you could track what actually happens on the landscape and assess how well your management has been doing. Are we doing, how are we doing in terms of cumulative impacts, or are we sort of keeping things the same? Have we actually reduced the amount of seismic lines and fragmentation on the landscape by reclamation, or are things starting to get worse? Referring back to that historic benchmark, you can make some kind of assessment and adjust your management accordingly. That's under the assumption that climate doesn't change. But now what happens when climate changes? And some of the, for example, that 2080 projection, if that were to come true, well, now here you are as a manager, 80 years from now, and the ecosystems have gone through the blender basically, and now you're trying to do that same assessment, decide whether your management of human activity has been successful or not. Are we doing better or are we doing worse? But everything has changed, and it's no longer clear whether it's climate that's the root cause, or is it the human disturbances that are really the underlying problem, or a combination of both. It becomes really problematic. But what if you were to say, well, what about looking in an area that hasn't been impacted? What if we use that as a dynamic benchmark? Because here we are, I'm pointing to Wood Buffalo Park as a large intact area. It's going to be exposed to climate change exactly as every other part of the province is. It's going to be warming to the same extent, or arguably very close to the same extent as areas close by. Now, if this happens to turn into a parkland, for example, can't that be used as guidance to what would be happening in this part of the world in the absence of human development? Now, obviously, there's a loss here. It's not going to be able, you won't be able to get as fine of detail in terms of your benchmarks that you are by using, the actual landscape you're working on. But we don't have unlimited choices, and it seems to me this might be one. Now, there are several challenges with this approach, of course. Well, first of all, just more on how to do it here. So we could use monitoring of patches of undisturbed landscape, and then fill in the blanks through interpolation. Again, not as fine a detail as our current historical benchmarks, but is it a workable solution? Well, maybe it is. What could you use? Well, we do have the large protected areas like Wood Buffalo and so on, but we have a lot of smaller ones as well. In our case, in Alberta, we have some native prairie rangeland, south Suffield area, a lot of smaller protected areas. We have permanent sample plots in specific stands throughout the boreal forest. I think those could be used to provide insight. And in the case of species, it becomes more difficult. Probably the level of detail in these course level interpolations won't be sufficient, so we'd have to rely on actual monitoring of species, and there are problems there in terms of where a species is and where it might want to be, if you will, in terms of climate change. Maybe two different things, so habitat modeling may be required to keep track of what the appropriate goals are for individual species. Now, just as with the wait and see, there are certainly a range of problems in terms of using dynamic benchmarks. Kind of alluded to some of them in terms of actually implementing them. We do not have, good representation of all the different ecosystems, so our existing benchmarks are patchy. And we don't have the monitoring system in place today to make use of them in the way that you might want to for the purpose of applying the dynamic benchmark. Doesn't mean to say we can't do this. It's just that there's a lot of work that would be required. Second, and a distinct issue is that moving to a dynamic system really makes the whole issue of planning much more complex. You have a much larger decision space to work with. So if you have a static objective, you know what you're working with, and it's at least straightforward to go say, we're going to maintain an objective for the next 100 years. But if your objective keeps changing every 20 or 30 years, now it's much more complex for you to work with. And you may end up with trade-offs among time periods. So the right thing to do today might not be the right thing to do 20 years from now, and it may be not right for 50 years. So which one of those should you be targeting if you're having choice? you're also having to contend with multiple climate futures. As I said, there's quite a range between the least case and worst case scenario. So which one do you choose? You can perhaps go to a worst case to try to avoid, the worst things that might happen, but that's also the most uncertain. So you might go the other extreme and say, well, let's look at the least case scenario because all models effectively agree on that. They go farther. And there's many actions are not really viable until the climate actually changes. So you can't start growing ponderosa pine in Alberta in the north until we get a lot warmer. Lastly, we could look at a completely different approach, and that is to say, let's go functional. And in my review of the literature, I saw this mentioned quite frequently. So it says basically abandon structural targets altogether and go with something much broader, like maintain a functional landscape or ecosystem health. That. Now that's consistent with the fundamental goal, but there's a serious problem in that we don't today really have a good ability to measure and interpret ecosystem function. What does it really mean when we say that? The papers that I've mentioned that refer to it never actually answer that. We're going to maintain ecosystem function, but what does that look like? And there certainly is a problem in terms of the link to sensitive species, the one that we actually spent most of our effort on. Arguably, you could remove caribou from Alberta's landscape and it would go entirely unnoticed from the perspective of ecosystem function and so on. And that would be inconsistent with public interest. So I think ecosystem function has an important role in collaboration with structural targets, but it may be pretty difficult to make it work on its own because it is so coarse scale at this point. For example, try to imagine describing the boreal forest simply in terms of function, and then compare that to the level of detail that we use today in terms of various structural, attributes, patch size, and so on. It'd be a world of difference. All right. Last step, we could, give up on basically structural targets altogether and just work with something generic. Say, when it came to making a decision in terms of biodiversity and specifically what we're going to do in terms of the part of the land, we would say, well, the objective is to maximize the ability of species and ecosystems to survive and adapt. The understanding here is that we've got by now a pretty good idea of, what is it about our human disturbances that really are a problem for species? What is it that species require to maintain viability? So in theory, we should be able to go forward on that basis. The problem here is that we're driving blind. As I said, land use decisions and the actual objectives that you put down on the ground, they're compromised. And without any reference to where you start with, you can end up with a situation of gradual decline that's not really detected. So you don't really know where the original starting point was. And at every given point in time, what you have is your new norm, even though you're slowly ratcheting down. So I'll stop here to leave some time for questions. But as I said, I do have a discussion paper available. Just email me there, and that earlier report is available online, and the website is there as well. So I'd be pleased to answer any questions that anyone has at this point.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Rick. So yes, let's just jump right into the question and answer period. Again, if you want to use the chat box to ask your question, feel free to go ahead and do that, and then I can just read it out loud for everybody. And if you're on the conference call line with us and would like to ask a question over the phone, I welcome you to just hit *6 and unmute your line. So is there anybody that would like to start us off with a question, either through the chat or over the conference call line? If so, please go right ahead. Well, I have a question, Rick, just to get things started here. So just in your opinion, how will effective planning be possible in the face of so much uncertainty?
Right. Well, I guess there are a few different approaches that can be considered. In terms of adapting to change as it goes, we do have the option, that's actually the reality of planning and replanting. It's not that we're going to have to we only have one stab at this. We're going to plan for a certain species or a certain region, and we have to get it right in terms of picking the right climate scenario and picking the the best option in terms of long-term outcomes and putting it down and living with that outcome. The reality is that almost all of our plans, any ones that I can think of, they're under constant revision. Maybe it's 5 years, maybe it's even 10 years, a cycle in terms of revising them. But climate changes, even though it's fairly rapid in a geological time span, in terms of management, it's not that fast. And I think if we replan every 5 years, I think we can certainly adapt to some things that are coming along. There's also the idea that's been proposed of robust strategies. So I guess what it's trying to get at is getting away from the idea that we can predict the future and that we will, choose our way of managing that is the optimum. For example, think of the way we do manage forests. We do timber supply analysis that basically says we have a pretty good understanding of exactly how many trees will be out there 100 years from now. So we'll define where we're going to cut and how we're going to cut. And, I'm not saying that doesn't work well. It does work well. But under a scenario of climate change, and particularly when you're looking at biodiversity outcomes that are much less clear than, growth of timber, maybe that approach isn't the best one to use anymore. Maybe instead of saying we can predict the future and we can predict the optimum choices in terms of management that will get us to that future, we'll have to say something like, well, you know what, there's 3 or 4 possibilities. At this point, we're not sure which one is going to work. So when we devise a management plan, why don't we do something that is, well, there's different ways to go about that. You can look at the least damage, one that's, even if you end up with a worst case scenario, you've kind of covered your bases on that. Or you could look at, trying to get something that will work across all of them to some degree or other. It's trying to optimize across multiple outcomes as opposed to just one. And there are various approaches to doing this. And ultimately, you're trying to lower your risk of having a bad outcome. And then the last thing I think worth mentioning is the whole concept of adaptive management, where we might say, part of, I guess, under the robust strategy approach, we don't have great clarity around what will happen. So let's try different things in different places, understanding that we're going to fail in some areas, but we're going to learn from that, and that'll provide the basis for us to become more adept at dealing with the changes that do arise.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. We do have some questions in the chat box. So Roger Mayer says, regional planning in Alberta is looking at a biodiversity framework approach. So how do you see climate change fitting into the biodiversity approach being looked at in Alberta?
Right. So that hasn't been released yet, and I think it'll be an important component of this. Now, ideally, it would be great to have climate change integrated into that, but it's sort of one step at a time. And as I've said, we're going to look at a scenario of planning and replanning. I think from my understanding of that biodiversity management framework, it's trying to pull together a lot of the disparate pieces that we do have in play in Alberta and provide a consistent framework that ties the whole package together. That in itself is a huge jump forward. Now, I don't believe that climate change is directly going to be in that framework, but is that a big problem? I think let's start with something, and then as we go forward, we see what that looks like. We can specifically address where climate change can integrate into it. For example, I could see this issue of preparing to be a component that should at an early stage be part of the biodiversity framework. Whether it makes it into this first iteration or a later one, that's certainly an area where I think we could quite quickly move forward.
Okay, great. Thank you. We have a question from Stephen Mills. So Rick, you had mentioned using permanent sample plots as possible sampling points. Is there changes needed to the PSP data collection process to better match biodiversity objectives?
I can't answer that. I don't have enough knowledge about those specifics. What I understand is that there is, at least in Alberta, there's an development underway to try to coordinate and reinvigorate the program. But I think there's an issue regarding effective replanting areas that are, where there's a slow drop off of some areas are lost to other forms of development, and so on. So there are steps, I think, that are in place now to start to reinvigorate the process. But the detail of what you're asking, I can't answer. I do know the whole concept of monitoring will have to adjust. And one thing we do have in Alberta is the Alberta Biodiversity Monitoring Institute, who's actively, systematically monitoring biodiversity across the province. And the focus currently is on separating out change from human effects, human disturbances, and so on, from the natural state, to be able to parse those differences out. And in the future, the challenge will be to now have two agents of change on the landscape working at the same time. So maybe not so much the monitoring, but certainly analysis. And I suspect it will, go back to the monitoring as well. But the issue is, how do we go about effectively separating out those two agents of change when they're both active at the same time?
Okay, great. Thank you. I don't see anybody typing here, but is there anybody on the conference call line that has a question? Give you a few seconds here. And then just as we're waiting for if there's any last questions, I will point out that if you notice in the chat box there, Jason Edwards has posted a forum discussion on the FA COP to continue this discussion. So just make sure everybody is aware of that. So that's great. Thank you. So I'll just give a couple more seconds here for any last minute questions for Rick before we sign off. Okay. Well then, I guess we will wrap things up here. So thank you again to everyone who joined us today for the FA COP webinar. We definitely hope you enjoyed it. And obviously a big thank you goes out to you, Rick, for your time and effort, for great presentation and discussion. Any last comments from you before we sign off here?
I'd maybe just point out that the discussion paper that I've mentioned it's available. It's first draft. There's another section that will follow that looks at this adaptation strategies more specifically. This section looks at just the objective issue, which we've talked about here today, and maybe getting, perhaps back to the question about regional planning in Alberta. I think some of those more on-the-ground adaptation strategies that Roger was asking about will be covered under that section of the paper. So anyway, basically, stay tuned. By the end of March, that paper, at least draft form, will be available for anybody to have detail.
Okay, great. And I may be in contact just to see if we can post that on the community of practice as well.
Sure.
So, okay, well then, thanks again, everyone, and thanks for joining us, and have a great week.